Today we take up a topic known as state responsibility. The topic of state responsibility is a very important topic in the area of international law. It is an important topic in the area of international law for the simple reason that there are plenty of instances wherein a state is made liable to foreign departments, foreign governments, and foreign nationals or aliens. In circumstances such as this, what exactly is the rule of international law is the question that is being put to students as well as scholars. When we take into consideration the definition of state responsibility, the definition of state responsibility is it is defined as the responsibility of a state for internationally wrongful acts. Now, what exactly you mean by the responsibility of a state for internationally wrongful acts? Now, the wrong which is being done to a foreign national or an alien or a corporation of a foreign state must be accepted as a fault or a mistake in a rule of international law. Only in such cases the liability can be imputed to the concerned state. That is where all wrongs or mistakes or offences which are perpetrated under the topic of state responsibility must be in accordance with the international law. It should meet the requirements of international law. Now, there are plenty of instances wherein the states go to the extent of pointing out that what is being done by us is justified. Now, when I speak of this, suppose for example, in the ordinary course of nature, now states when they come together and they meet together, when the populations of the states, remember, move from one place to another, there will be certain instances wherein some violations might take place. Now, if the violation, if in the ordinary course of nature, if it is only a trivial matter, or it is a simple offense that is being perpetrated, naturally the concerned state might say apologies. Now, by saying, giving apologies through the embassy of the concerned state to the foreign state, naturally the matter will be treated as closed. But then there are certain instances wherein these apologies won't do. And these apologies will not be accepted because more than the dignity of the state, damage is caused to the property of that state. When I speak about damage to the property of that state, remember this much. In the era of globalization, lots and lots of companies go and function in a foreign country. And when they start functioning, they will have kept their establishment in that state. Suppose take it this way. There are plenty of Indian companies which go to UAE, United Arab Emirates. And you can see them in the state of Bahrain, you can see them in Dubai, you can see them in Saudi Arabia, you can see them in Oman, or you can see them even other places. Now, in circumstances such as this, when these companies go there, naturally they will have an establishment of their own. And these establishments require people to run the show. When they actually run the show in these establishments, the concerned state which has given permission to establish such companies naturally fails to protect them, or it ill-treats the nationals who actually manage the company, or their installations or establishments are being harmed. Now, in situations like this, remember, mere apology that is being tendered by the host state, permitting them to enter and thereafter ill-treating them will not be accepted. Now, the matter naturally should be treated in accordance with the provisions of international law. Now, when I speak about the provisions of international law, you may be interested to know what kind of or how state responsibility might arise. Now, these instances when it is being spoken, most of the text writers on this subject point out state responsibility might arise by two modes. Now, the first mode is called as an action. Now, the second one is popularly called as an omission. Now, the action which is being taken by a particular state against a foreign national who is in their territory, or against a foreign establishment, or an ill treatment that is being meted, or an act of nationalization of the property that is being done. So naturally, it is an action that is being initiated by the host state against foreign property or foreign nationals. Now the second one that is being spoken is omission. Suppose, for example, the concerned state is supposed to act and it is liable to act, but then it is not acting or it is not protecting the alien nationals there. Suppose, for example, during the course of a riot, now in the Byelorussia, now you must have seen over the TV, lots of protests are taking place against the established ruler, against the established regime. Now in circumstances such as this, it is the duty of the government of the day to protect aliens in that territory, foreigners in that territory. Suppose, take it this way, instead of protecting them, they keep quiet, omission, they don't do anything. Or there are certain instances wherein they exceed their competence. Now, in situations of this type, what exactly is the liability under the rules of international law is the question that is being taken. So, state responsibility in international law for internationally wrongful acts may arise either by action or by omission. Now, in both the circumstances, the concerned state which has taken the action or the concerned state which has failed to take an action is liable under international law. Now, having discussed this much, remember the concept of state responsibility is still in a fluid state. It is yet to mature into a real topic of what we call as legal stature. Legal rules, because of the circumstances, because of the new developments, are still in a developing stage. Now, the International Law Commission has taken up the very concept of state responsibility to devise and to formulate certain rules on state responsibility. The matter was taken up in 1974 itself, but then it started pursuing the matter since 1978. And since 1978, it has been doing it, and it was going on even up to 2001. But then the task which was given to the International Law Commission by the United Nations naturally has been able to do something good in this matter, that is state responsibility. Now you may be interested to know what exactly the limits between international law and municipal law relating to state responsibility. Now, before I speak about the limits and between international law and municipal law relating to state responsibility, I just intend to highlight the recent trends and the changes and new issues that come up on a topic of this type. Now, you might be knowing, especially certain ultra hazardous activities that are perpetrated by a particular state. In situations of this kind, you do not know what exactly is the liability. You might be knowing the virus, Wuhan virus, has its origin in the state of People's Republic of China. Now, when it has taken place in such places, to what extent or how far, or whether it is possible to make the People's Republic of China answerable under rules of international law on the state responsibility is a question. It is yet to be done. You don't find such rules. People might say the concerned state may be held liable, made answerable. Under what rules? Are there conventional rules on this subject? So these are all new areas. Simultaneously, now you have what we call as one instance which has developed in the recent past, happened to be in 1975. And this instance happened to be an instance relating to the Chernobyl disaster. Now, Chernobyl disaster has taken place in 1985. Now, this disaster has taken place in the year 1985 because of the nuclear installations which are kept in ships. And this was kept in Georgia. And thereafterwards, you might be knowing the state of Soviet Russia were collapsed, and most of them separated, and they became new members of the United Nations. In circumstances such as this, from Chernobyl, from these nuclear installations, hazardous activities slowly and steadily over a period of time, over the years, spread. And it is spread into the entire, what we call as the European countries, especially the Scandinavian countries. And it was supposed to cause devastating effect. Now, in circumstances such as this, the United Nations came to know, and it adopted a convention, and this convention is known as the Convention on Early Notification. In the event of ultra-hazardous releases and activities conducted by a state with knowledge or without knowledge, and its consequences were to reach to areas beyond the portals or forts of the territories of that country, it is the duty of that state to give all the information. And it is the duty of that state to notify other states this has taken place, and then inform the authorities like WHO. You have plenty of the organizations in various under various conventions, so that they would come into the picture and they will be in a position to tackle the problem. Now, the most recent activity happened to be an issue relating to sonic boom. Now, sonic boom has become a bane for the society. Now, these supercharged sonic jets, which are manufactured by what we call as the developed countries, during the time of landing as well as during the time of takeoff, create huge sounds. Now, you think of international airports, and think of the people who reside outside these international airports. And most of them who live outside these airports will have bought their flats. Now, at the time of buying the flat, the concerned what we call as the builder will have stated to them the assurance of the building is for at least 30 years. Now, because they go there, they start occupying, and thereafterwards what happens is the supersonic jets come and go, and during the time of landing as well as takeoff, the entire building starts shaking. Especially in the state of Japan, this has become a usual practice. So what was promised by the contractor cannot be realized, because if the same thing were to continue, the building may fall any time and it may break any time. In circumstances such as this, whom you can sue? Most of them are international airliners, and they are heavy jets. Now, this is again a new issue which are yet to be tackled under the present day international law. Now, when we take up the limits between what we call as international law and municipal law, what exactly are the limits between international law and municipal law? Now, when I speak about the limits between international law and municipal law, you have to just know the limits between what we call as a federal state and its member. Now, you take the state of the United States as well as the state of India. Now, there you have 50 states and there is a federal government. In India, you have so many states in this country, if not 50, and there will be a government at the center. Suppose, for example, the foreign nationals or foreign companies come to the city of Bangalore. And when they come to the city of Bangalore, these companies start establishing many IT companies you have. Now, you take an instance relating to the government of Karnataka. The government of Karnataka takes a decision, and having taken a decision, some loss is being caused to the companies. In circumstances such as this, under international law, the government of Karnataka, although is a federal member, will not come into the picture. Almost all the activities done by the government of Karnataka is imputed to the state, and that is the state of India. And the state of India is vicariously answerable for almost all the faults, all the mistakes, all the excesses that is being perpetrated here in the state of Karnataka. Now, this is generally the rule of international law. In matters pertaining to state responsibility, the federal member in a federation will not come into the picture. For all purposes, it is only the federal government that represents the concerned state. I shall give you one more instance, one more illustration, and this illustration happened to be an illustration relating to the Bhopal gas tragedy. Now you might be knowing the company was established, and afterwards one fine morning there was a leakage. And because of this leakage there were deaths. More than 2,000 deaths have taken place in the year, what we call as 1984. And many people have suffered, and many people have lost their, what we call as manlyhood, many other things. Now the matter was, first and foremost, in order to file a suit in the state of New York, wherein the concerned company was established, the state of India passed the Bhopal Act in the year 1985. And this immediately, that was the first thing which was done by the government of India. Now, to almost all the claims of the victims, as well as the future victims, were taken by the government of India, that is central government. It was not given to the government of Madhya Pradesh. And having taken up their claim, the state of India filed a petition in Keenan's court in New York. And when it filed a case in Keenan's court in New York, Mr. Keenan was very sharp and very clever. He went to the extent of pointing out the government of the entire Constitution of India is accepted as a very good constitution. And the state of India became an independent nation. And after becoming independent, remember, it was in a position to adopt far-reaching reforms as well. And it has an apex court, and the decisions of the apex court are highly respected, and it is being read by juries as well as students of law and even teachers all over the world. In circumstances such as this, when it is a civilized, advanced country having adopted a democratic structure, it is most unfair to exercise jurisdiction here. And he went to the extent of saying that the issue should be parked in India because the company is situated in India, it is functioning in India, and the loss that is being caused, remember, by the company to the Indians. Deaths have taken place of Indians. Naturally, we came back and filed the suit in what we call as the Sessions Court of Bhopal. So the first task you should remember, for all purposes in this matter, the act is attributed to the federal organ, is attributed to the state. It may have been done in New York, but still, when we speak about the government of the United States, is answerable. When we speak about the other matter in India, although it is being done in Bhopal, and the matter relating to the claims of the victims are taken up by the government of India. For all purposes in international law, it is the federal government that is only answerable, is the fundamental point which is being harped upon. Now, having said this much, I just intend to speak to you one important development that has taken place in this regard. Now, what exactly are the limits between international law and municipal law? Now, when I speak about the limits between international law and municipal law, first one is there must be some breach of duty by the organ or the state. Now, when I speak about this breach of duty by some organ or the state, now what do you mean by breach of duty by some organ or the state? Suppose, for example, within the state there is an agency which is known as the police agency. And the police agency is supposed to protect foreign nationals, and they are asked to protect them. Now, instead of going there, they just remember while away the time, they don't do anything. So, police is supposed to guard and protect the people, which include aliens as well. So, instead of guarding and protecting, they indulge in an act which is not permitted to do. So, in circumstances such as this, now there is a breach of duty. It can be imputed to the concerned state. Although it is done by an organ of the state, it is imputed to the state. Now then the second one is, now the other one is omission of duty. Suppose, for example, the police forces are sent to the concerned states. Now they don't do anything, or they perform excesses. Suppose, for example, in a troubled area, police people are sent wherein aliens are also resident. And when they are residents there, the police people, remember, fire at aliens intentionally. In circumstances such as this, the very act which is being done by the police organ is imputed to the concerned state. So suppose, for example, lots of Indians go there and work, especially in the Gulf countries. In 20 Gulf countries or in 20 Islamic countries, we have as many as 35 lakhs of people. And they are all, remember, people of India. Now at that time, it is the duty of the concerned host state to give protection. There might be instances wherein some trouble that is taking place. During the course of the trouble, it is the duty of the concerned state to protect them. And remember, to give protection under all circumstances. Instead of giving protection, if they abstain from doing anything, or if they exceed their powers and go outside the competence of their authority, in both the circumstances, it is answerable. Now, when I speak of this, always you should remember the very concept of state responsibility and the liability under state responsibility is always determined in accordance with the rules of international law and not in accordance with the state law. There are instances wherein a particular state go to the extent of saying that what we have done is perfect and it is in accordance with our state law. An international tribunal first will verify this, whether it is in accordance with the state law. And the very act, although is perfect in accordance with the state law, if it is not in conformity with international law, the concerned state is still answerable under international law. Always that is where the superiority of international law in matters of state responsibility is above board. Whatever you do, whatever you carry out, whatever you execute, or whatever you fail to do or abstain from doing, it should be, remember, in accordance with the rules of international law. Your state law and quoting of that principle, quoting of that provision before an international tribunal is not going to serve any purpose. Now, having said this much, I just intend to speak about the defenses to state responsibility. Now, are there any defenses? Now, in the event of some problem that is taking place, the concerned state, whether it is in a position to take some defense, or before the court of arbitration, or before the courts in the mixed claims commission, what defenses a concerned state is empowered to take? The first question is, are there defenses? And if there are defenses, what type of defenses? Now, the first defense that is being given or being spoken at length happened to be the concerned state, when it is questioned why such a thing has taken place, it may say it was actually under the control and power of another state when such action was taking place. So if it were to say that it is under the control and power of another state when such an action was initiated, it is one of the defenses, and it is supposed to be a good defense. Now, the second defense that can be taken by a particular state happened to be, so the concerned state or the organs who are considered as victims or those who have lost the property the individual, they actually consented to such a decision. So the losers or the victims or the what we call as the people who have lost everything, they have consented to such a decision. So in circumstances such as this, remember, it is considered as a very good defense for all purposes. Now the third one is, there were certain things which is called as reprisals. Suppose for example, when an instance takes place, suppose for example, the aliens fight, and when they fight, remember, in order to protect the concerned state, by way of reprisal take a decision, because they have to protect their nationals in the receiving state. So if it is by way of reprisal, naturally it is considered as a good defense. Now the fourth defense that is being given is a force majeure or an act of God. The whole episode, the whole incident, or a whole what we call as the tragedy has taken place due to an act of God. We were not in a position to control. We are not in a position to rescue. No, just imagine a situation in Ryland versus Fletcher's, 1868. So that was accepted as a good defense there. So similar defense, for example, we are not in a position to control. Suppose, for example, now flood is taking place all over the world. In circumstances like this, it is not under the control of anyone. You cannot control. No, you have remember, you can take measures to prevent or to do something. But then if the rain is what we call as horrendous, torrential, now how you can control? In circumstances of this nature, if some damage is caused to alien property or foreign property, if some foreign nationals are washed away during the floods in the river, remember what decision ought to have been taken if taken. What decision ought to have been taken if taken by the concerned state which has given residence permit to them. The state is not answerable in international law. That is what it says. It is an act of God. And in an act of God, it doesn't make any distinction between aliens and nationals. All will lose or all may be protected. They try to protect, but in spite of the protection that is being given, the incident has taken place and the liability. Now, when we speak of state responsibility, there will be other two justifications that is being added. Now, four justifications were given by the International Law Commission in the year 1978. That was finalized and submitted for approval in 1979. In the year 1980, the International Law Commission gave two more defenses. And you may be interested to know what is this two more. One is self-defense. And the second one is a state of necessity. Necessity knows no law. Now the act is perpetrated due to necessity. And there was no other option but to take such a decision. Under necessity, this decision is being taken, and this is considered as a justification. Now you might be knowing there is one more which is called as self-defense. Now the decision is being taken under self-defense. But then your what we call as defense of self-defense will not be accepted under municipal law. Your act of self-defense has to be justified before an international tribunal in accordance with the international law. Any measure of self-defense that is being perpetrated or taken by a state, remember, can only be accepted as a defense if it is in accordance with, remember, rules of international law. And if it is not in accordance with the rules of international law, it will not be accepted as a good defense. Now, having spoken about this much, I intend to take to you state responsibility for breach of treaties, breach of contracts, and expropriation or nationalization of foreign property. Now, when I speak about state responsibility for breach of contract, now when I speak of breach of contract, naturally, breach of contract, if it takes place, the contract law itself is giving the answer. It has given the answer. You just think of our contract law, Indian Contract Act or some other country's contract act. In the event of a breach of a contract, what shall be done and what measures or what protection is given to the aggrieved party is stated in the terms of the contract. Suppose, for example, there will be a contract, and according to the contract, the alien national is invited to a country. So foreigners come here and start working. And in the event of a breach of a contract, what shall be done is provided in the terms of the contract itself. But one important aspect we have to remember, contracts which are opposed to public policy are void under the law. It cannot be enforced. All contracts which are being entered between a state and nationals or corporations or what we call as municipalities of particular state should be in accordance with the existing law. We should not be opposed to public policy. Now this is the fundamental point that is being harped upon in all cases. Now the other important aspect that is being spoken is the responsibility for breach of treaty. When we take up treaties, the terms and the rights and liabilities are provided of the parties are indicated in the treaty itself. When I speak about this, suppose for example, take it this way, the investment agreements these days. Now the government of India has invited almost all the countries of the world who have money or capital to come here and invest. And when they come here and invest in the Make in India projects, naturally first is they have to accept the Indian law. And not only they have to accept the Indian law in all matters pertaining to what we call as jurisdiction, the courts in this country are supposed to exercise jurisdiction on them. So two important factors. First one is they are bound to accept the Indian law, and in the event of a dispute, they are bound to approach for the redressal of their problem or redressal for the loss that is being suffered by them through and by the Indian courts. In all matters, this is final. And regarding the terms of the treaty, they will have stated the treaty will expire after 10 years. Most of the international treaties are signed for a period of 10 years. A few of them are for 5 years, and a few of them are for a period of 2 years. When the term expires, the rights and liabilities of the parties which are indicated under the provisions of the treaty naturally come to an end. Now thereafterwards, when we go further, under the present day international law, most of the difficulties that come in with regard to treaties happen to be the treaties which are earlier signed by the developed states with the developing countries. Now when the United Nations came to be established, there were hardly 40 plus states. And after 20 years, remember, another 100 countries were added as members of the United Nations. When I speak about these 100 countries, most of them were colonies. And these colonies were ruled by the colonial masters. We were ruled by the state of Great Britain. There were several colonies of the state of Great Britain, both in the east, in the west, in the south and the north. And simultaneously there were colonies by the state of France, the state of Netherlands, all of them. And most of these colonies became independent. And when they became independent, now what would happen to the treaties which were, remember, signed earlier? Most of the states who were earlier colonies, when they became independent, they said, we don't want these imperialist treaties at all. We should be given a free hand. So with the result, remember, all those treaties, since the state itself has become new and independent and admitted as a member of the international communities, wanted to, remember, start its activities with a clean slate and a green slate. Now it began. Now what has happened again in the international sphere was, although they wanted to start their activities and life and economic reforms with a clean slate, they did not have enough resources. Now one important lacuna was financial resources. And the second one is the technical know-how. And the third one is the technical men who are in a position to assist. So what has happened was these colonial masters, they naturally went to the state, went to the help and rescue of these underdeveloped and developing countries. They said, we will give you protection, we will give you technology, we will give you the money. No, that is what is happening with the People's Republic of China now. Most of the African nations, maybe in the Latin American nations, are given finance. And the finance is given for economic activities. And remember, if you are not in a position to pay this money over a period of time, what will happen is it will annex, or it will make you to listen what they say. And it is, remember, the very life of the state will be in perennial, perpetual perennial, and you will be subjugated, and you have to listen to the master, what it says, because you are not in a position to speak. That is where some of the states, for example, the state of Kenya, said, no, we don't want any loan, and we want to be free. We will carry on our activities without it. And now this situation came in the 1960s, between 1955 and 1960. Now these colonial masters, when they assured these developing states, the least developed states, to give every form of assistance, Pandit Nehru, Marshal Tito, and a few other leaders now established what we call as the non-aligned movement. We don't want to align with anybody, we are non-aligned. Thus started what we call as the famous non-aligned movement. It was very significant in those days. And we don't require your capital. And they said this is neo-colonialism. Colonialism has come to an end, but then you are starting neo-colonialism. We are not after it. Now, with the result, what has happened was the United Nations adopted a resolution. And this resolution is what we call as sovereignty over the natural resources resolution of 1960. Now, each country, however poor it is in a position to exercise sovereign rights over its resources. And these natural resources cannot become a part and parcel of any sovereign state, except the state to which belongs and where it is. Now, this resolution was actually a great morale booster for the developing and the least developed countries. No, it did not stop there. Now, thereafter, 4 years prior to that, that is there were several resolutions which were adopted. And you might be knowing the self-determination resolution which was adopted in the late 1950s. That was also a landmark resolution. Now each country is sovereign to determine what type of government it wants. Freedom of choosing the type of political power is left to the discretion of that state which elects its representatives. It need not be guided by anyone at any time. So they wanted to give, remember, stop the developed world in entering into what we call as spheres of influence in the developing states. Now then came what we call as a new international economic order in the year 1975. In the year 1974, what we call as the doctrine or the convention on the basic rights and economic rights and duties of states was adopted. The Economic Rights Convention, which was adopted, went to the extent of protecting what we call as the developed, not the developed countries, but the economies of the developing and the least developed countries. Simultaneously, the New International Economic Order. The New International Economic Order wanted to protect not only the sovereignty of these developing and the least developed countries, but it wanted to protect the resources for themselves. Now that is what has happened. So in circumstances such as this, what has happened was the era of nationalization began. This is called as expropriation of foreign property. Now in the era of expropriation of foreign property, If expropriation is done, the basic question is expropriation legal? Now, expropriation is naturally legal. Suppose, for example, if somebody comes and invests in our territory, we have the natural right to expropriate the property. But the basic question is compensation has to be paid. And compensation, if it is not paid, it becomes illegal. Because most of the instances, I can just give you 2 or 3 instances so that you come to explain the point better. Now, especially in the state of Iran, in the 19th century, it's in the last part of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, several British multinationals have gone and invested in the original state of Persia. Having invested money, they were able to bring out oil wells. They dug oil wells, and afterwards oil was produced. And when once oil was produced, naturally this was sold. And the company made lots of money, and the benefit also was shared with the concerned state. Now thereafterwards Persia had disappeared and the state of Iran came. When the state of Iran naturally became the head or replacing the state of Persia, the basic question that came up was, these companies are making so much of money, they have looted the nation and their property has to be expropriated. The point is, one fine morning they said they expropriated property and compensation, they did nothing, they did not give. And the matter landed before the International Court of Justice because the company's claim was taken by the state of Great Britain. They were British nationals. Company was registered in the state of England. And an individual's claim can be taken up by the concerned state, and it went before the International Court of Justice. And before the International Court of Justice, they argued saying that this act is done without paying compensation. And there was a treaty which was entered earlier with the state of Persia. And the treaty in one of the clauses went to the extent of protecting what we call as these aliens who had gone to the state of Persia to explore and exploit property on behalf of the state of Persia. Now, the successor state, that is the state of Iran, is paying nothing and simply making some allegations saying that they have looted and it is the money of the Iranis and they will not be given anything. And the reply that was given by the Deputy Foreign Minister of the state of Iran before the International Court of Justice is, remember, to be known by everybody. He went to the extent of making certain castigated, unwarranted remarks against these British nationals who were exploiting and exploring oil. And they said they have looted and they have sucked our blood and they cannot be given anything. The International Court of Justice, or the Judges of the International Court of Justice, they said, remember, it may be a music to the ears, but in the province of law, it cannot be accepted. And they said, first is, for taking away the property, are you paying compensation or not? Because they have established, for many, they came to your country and having established themselves, and for the establishment which they have done, they have invested lots and lots of money, and appointed lots of services also, employed lots of people, gave employment to your people, brought their own technical people, for which you have to pay compensation. Without compensation, how this can be accepted? And it awarded, but then the compensation is not paid. Now this was one important factor. Now the point at issue in circumstances such as this, the claimants here, especially the British government before the International Court of Justice, pointed out that there is a treaty obligation. Now when I speak about the treaty obligation, it is not enough if you state the provisions of the treaty. It is the responsibility of the concerned state to prove beyond doubt to the satisfaction of the court that the provisions of the treaty correctly and directly stated to protect the oil company in the state of Iran. No, this was the message that was given It is not just enough you say everything is stated, we are going to be protected. But then you have to prove to the satisfaction of the court or before the court of arbitration or whichever tribunal you are, or approaching the tribunal in any case. Now the second thing is, expropriation can be done or nationalization of property can be done. Now when nationalization of foreign property is done, first one is compensation has to be paid. The second the question that comes is, compensation to be paid means what? There are plenty of instances wherein in African countries, especially Uganda under Idi Amin and some other countries, they nationalize the property of foreigners. When they nationalize the property of foreigners, when they asked for compensation, they said, if you don't go away, you will be killed. And they had to run for life, and they ran for life, and they came to England, a few of them, and they became British nationals. And they were not given anything, whatever money they had. And in some, especially in the bank of the British banks, they had kept money, all those monies which were saved, and with the result, the state of Great Britain gave them nationality, and then they thrived there. Now, suppose, for example, they will say, after nationalization, they go to the extent of pointing out, we will give you only tickets, air tickets, to those foreigners who have come. These foreigners have gone there. They brought their technical staff and they start working there, invested their money so much. And one fine morning, when it started yielding the fruit, you take away and you pay, we will give only air tickets to those people to go back to their country. Will it be accepted? Compensation, remember, should be just. This is the fundamental point in this. Always compensation has to be paid. Now, when I speak about the other important factors, you should also know. Now, under the what we call as sovereignty over the natural resources resolution, as well as the new international economic order, Charter of Economic Rights and Duties of States of 1974, the members of the international community, they said they wanted to please the developing countries. When they wanted to please the developing countries, they said nationalization for public purpose in accordance with the rules of international law was eliminated. These two words, eliminated. So always today when we speak of what we call as nationalization, nationalization should always be for a public purpose. So in those days, in 1974, some of them wanted to please the developing countries. Their force and the pressure was so much. So the word public purpose as well as in accordance with international law was deleted. Immediately, the developed countries said, if these two words are deleted, I don't think no sensible person will go to a developing state or a least developed state and make an investment. And if he had to make an investment, in the event of taking his property, there shall be compensation. And this compensation must be just, adequate, and effective. Now, what do you mean by just, adequate, and effective? When I speak of the just, adequate, and effective compensation, remember, loss to the tune of the loss suffered. Suppose, for example, a particular person loses the property. When he loses the property after nationalization, it has to be estimated in accordance with the market rates. What exactly is the market rate on that day? And thereafterwards, complete assessment of the loss that has to be done. Having done this, remember, he should be in a position to take the money that is being valued to a country of his choice. Effective. When I speak about effective compensation on the day. Now then, a question came up whether, suppose for example, in certain companies, top scientists or top technical people have come and they have become owners of patents. And remember, they have established such a goodwill. Foreign company in another country, whether goodwill as well as patents are also to be taken into consideration for purpose of counting compensation. Now there are plenty of instances they went to the extent of saying, both patents which are earned by the investor in the receiving state, as well as the money and fortune that is being made, had to be taken into consideration. When I speak about the goodwill, lots of goodwill, see, companies have established a goodwill. This also should be taken into consideration while awarding compensation. Now, one more thing that is being spoken, suppose for example, a company has made investment and the property is being nationalized. And when it is nationalized, for example, future prospects, suppose we are allowed to function in this country. For 15 or 20 years we will function. In 15 or 20 years we would have earned this much. That is called the estimation of the loss from the date of nationalization for another 20 years. Should this be taken into consideration? There are plenty of awards, and these awards went to the extent of pointing out this cannot be accepted. There may be few in arbitration tribunals they may have accepted, but they don't. Adequate, effective and just compensation. So loss which is suffered, it has to be accepted in accordance with the market rate and on the day of nationalization. And all the losses are to be included and they are entitled for it. Now another aspect that is being spoken is, suppose for example, before making the investment, so there is a contract between a corporation of a particular state or the municipality of a particular state and a foreign government. And during the course of the contract, in the contract deed, the foreign government wants to, remember, narrate or to put in a clause. And this clause is, in the event of the act of nationalization, or any stringent measures that are being taken by the concerned state or by the company, it is the existing rules of international law decided in accordance with the court of arbitration that shall be final. Now this is called as the stabilization clause in an agreement. Now the stabilization clause naturally enhances the power of the investor to claim compensation in accordance with the existing rules of international law. Now, under the present day rules of international law, most of the investment agreements, when they sign, they try to refer the matter to courts of arbitration, maybe London Court of Arbitration or the Paris Chamber of Commerce or some other courts, so as to not to, remember, delete anything or not to give importance to rules of municipal law, but it should be governed in accordance with the rules of international law. Now the concept of paying equal compensation came in the 1920s. It was Mr. Hull, the Secretary of the State of United States, introduced a formula. And in this formula he said compensation in all cases are to be paid, come what may. Without compensation, it is just not possible. The state of United States make investment in Latin America. It will make investments in the Caribbean, and it will make investments in the East European countries and other parts of the world. But then, in the event of the property's nationalization, naturally compensation has to be paid. And he was the one who was championing what we call as the principle of just compensation in almost all cases. Having discussed this much, we just refer to what we call as the Calvo clause. What do you mean by Calvo clause? What is its relevance today, and whether it is still accepted as a principle of international law? Calvo happened to be an Argentinian jurist. And the Argentinian jurist in 1925 and 1926, what he said, he wanted the insertion of a clause. And the insertion of a clause and the terms are very simple. In all matters pertaining to the merits and the content of the contract, the law of the investing state is final. I shall speak to you the brief history of this. Lots of American investors would go to Latin America. And having gone to Latin America in the garb of investment, in the guise of making some investment there, for trivial things, small things, they will make use of the protection of their home government, that is United States of America. And with the result, it was very difficult for the investment receiving state to control these investors. For simple things, American Secretary of State will phone up and say, no, it's not like this. Or some other things, American government will say, we will just capture you, we will do like this, blackmail. At that time, this Argentinian jurist, he just said, introduced Calvo clause. Now the Calvo clause proposes that in all matters pertaining to the terms of the contract and the future disputes or misunderstanding that may arise, the investor has to prefer only the local jurisdiction and courts of the investment receiving state. So they said, in all terms governing the contract, suppose for example, he goes there and he makes the investment and he employs the people, he brings his own people from the home state, he employs the local men, and if something happens to, or if the property were to be nationalized, first and foremost, for all purposes, the investor should go to the local courts. And only after exhausting local remedies, remember, he can invoke the protection of his home state. Local remedy rule is supposed to be an important rule under state responsibility. So an investor, in the event of a dispute, suppose for example, foreign investors come here. Having come here, they invest the money. And having invested one fine morning, the property is being taken away. At that time, it is the duty of the investors first and foremost to have a recourse to the law of the state of India, and matter should go to the courts in this country. And thereafterwards, if suppose for example, if the judgment is one-sided, then only the government, their government can intervene for purpose of getting compensation and to see that the matter is redressed once for all and the victim is protected. Otherwise, it is not possible. Now, what exactly the validity of the Calvo clause today? Now, you might be knowing in international law, every state has the right to protect its subjects. Every state has the right to protect its subjects. Now, but then the subject, when he goes there, commits himself to a foreign land and will carry on his activities there. And when he conducts himself in a foreign country after investment, naturally he is supposed to obey the law of the land. And if you apply the Calvo clause, no citizen or no national can contract away his right to protect him. Suppose, for example, for all purposes governing the contract, he shall be liable to the law of Argentina or Mexico, and the investor is an American. Can anybody contract away the right of his home state, which has given him nationality, to give up this right? Remember, it is one of the basic rights of a state to protect its nationals. And to that extent, Calvo clause is bad. Each state reserves the right. There are instances, if you go to history and read history, instances wherein just for the sake of protection of its nationals, they have declared war against other countries. This is only relating to investment. So he cannot just say, to that extent it is bad. Now the state of Great Britain, in all contracts, remember, pointed out, local remedy rule must be exercised for all purposes. Local remedy rule must be exercised for all purposes. So when the state of Great Britain makes an investment in Argentina or Chile or Ecuador or any other country, for all purposes governing the contract, it is the local law. You have to trust the legal system. And if you don't trust the legal system, how can you invest there? For any investment, you have to first and foremost to trust the legal system of the investment receiving state. And only when you do that, the whole thing will be smooth. And if there are afterwards, suppose for example, if the judgment is not partial, if it is not acceptable, then the home state will question and the foreign ministry will come into the picture and the matter will be sorted out. That is permitted under international law. Before that, it cannot be done. Now, these are certain issues. Today, act of nationalization or expropriation is legal. But when nationalization is being done, there are three fundamental formula principles which are being followed. And this is being strictly followed under the present day international law. Now, you will be interested to know what exactly are the three principles. Now, nationalization, when it is done, it is for a public purpose. Oh, it is done for a public purpose. The second one is, there cannot be and there should not be any discrimination between aliens as well as nationals. When the act of nationalization is done, you cannot discriminate between foreigners as well as nationals. Now the third one is, there cannot be the commission of an unjustified irregularity. Deliberately, you cannot commit an unjustified irregularity. So adequate, effective, just compensation has to be paid. Now these are the four principles which follow with the act of nationalization, especially under state responsibility. Now, in addition to the act of nationalization, Argentinian jurist is Drago. Drago was the man who pointed out something relating to what we call as foreign money which is being taken, which is relating to debts. Drago's name is identified in regard to debts that are being taken or owed to another foreign country. Now, when we take up the Dragonian doctrine, it is not Dragonian doctrine, doctrine of Drago. There are three other principles regarding debts. The first principle happened to be the principle which was given by Lord Palmerston. Lord Palmerston happened to be the Prime Minister of the State of England. And this Prime Minister of the State of England, remember, he was a Pakka imperialist. So imperialism was at its height at that time. He was of the opinion, and he pointed out in several of his speeches, money that is being given to a foreign country has to be returned as stipulated in the agreement. If money is not returned, remember, then there will be the diplomatic channels will open up. And if the diplomatic channels fail to get anything, then naturally it may lead to what we call as a war, a declaration of war, and ultimately the concerned territory for the sake of money will be annexed. So he was an imperialist. He said money has to be paid and there will be diplomatic intervention. And if diplomatic intervention fails to get anything satisfactory, then there will be military intervention. And military intervention may lead to the occupation or annexation of the territory. And when we come to the 20th century, this was totally unacceptable for almost all states. By then, democratic values and the protection of human rights had already come into vogue. At that time, Drago came into the picture. Drago, an Argentinian minister for foreign affairs, he said under no circumstances there can be military intervention. Military intervention in the event of a failure of a state to pay back the debts cannot take place, come what may. First and foremost, they should approach the negotiating table. Having approached the negotiating table, they should negotiate. If the concerned state, remember, if it is one of the Latin American countries, is not in a position to pay, it can demand buy time. And the concerned state which has given the money should be good enough and should be generous and should be Catholic in giving time, so that at the stipulated time the money as well as the interest that are levied can be paid. And there cannot be any military intervention. Now the third point he was harping upon was, for all purposes the concerned state should ask and keep asking, and what is being stated in the agreement should be final. Under no circumstances there can be intervention through its armed forces. That is not allowed. Now what is the present day role? Now if Palmerston as Drago have pointed out their viewpoints, what is the present day role? Under the present day international law, whenever assistance is being given, there shall be an agreement, which is prior to the lending of loans or money or other things. Now in the agreement itself or in the treaty itself that is being signed between the parties, they will have stipulated when the money has to pay, how it should be paid, in what manner. Remember, it has to be given. Is it by installments or it should be paid in a total sum? The money which is being taken and to be returned totally once and for all after 5 years. All these matters are covered in the agreement. That is how the matter is resolved. So we don't have any problem regarding the money now, because international agreements clearly provide provisions for this. How the money should be given, how it should be transferred, and how the repayment should take place. Now this part is a part of state responsibility. The remaining part we will give you in another lecture. Thank you.